Welcome, we're anda dumalang molo saubana hukandat, and a warm welcome to the Induvo Knowledgecast, the podcast where your curiosity meets insightful conversations. Today, imagine you're a sharp South African investor, eyeing up that prime property in Sandton. Or maybe you're thinking about buying into a booming local business. You're ready to put your hard-earned rands on the table, but how do you really know what those assets are worth?
That's a great question, and that's where IAS 36 comes in.
IAS 36.
Exactly. We're diving deep into this international accounting standard, straight from the source document itself.
Well, straight from the source.
Straight from the source.
So no fake news here.
No fake news here.
Right.
Think of it like a decoder ring for those complex financial statements.
Okay, now, I'm no chartered accountant, but luckily, I've got an expert here to help us break it down.
Well, I appreciate that. It's all about transparency. IAS 36 helps to make sure companies don't overstate the value of their assets, preventing those sneaky attempts to make their businesses look more profitable than they actually are. Savvy investors like yourself need to be able to see through those accounting tricks.
So, this standard is basically our weapon against those who try to pull the wool over our eyes.
You can think of it that way. I like to think of it more as a shield to protect your investments. You wouldn't buy a taxi with dodgy brakes, would you?
No, definitely not.
IAS 36 helps you check under the hood of a company's financials to see if everything is in working order.
I like that analogy. Okay, so IAS 36 applies to everything a company owns, right?
Not quite. It applies to most tangible assets, like property, plant, and equipment, and even some intangible assets, like goodwill.
Right.
But things like inventory, those borrowers and PAP, at your favorite Shizanyama, are handled under a different standard.
Right.
Same goes for financial instruments, like those JSE-listed shares you might be eyeing.
Okay, so no need to worry about impaired borrowers then. What else does an IAS 36 cover?
Employee benefits, like pensions and leave pay, are also excluded. They have their own accounting rules. IAS 36 is really focused on making sure companies don't overvalue those big-ticket items. That can really impact their financial health.
All right, so we know what IAS 36 is and what it covers. But when does an asset actually become impaired? Does it need a doctor's note?
Well, no doctor's note required, but it does need a thorough checkup. An asset is considered impaired when its carrying amount, that's what the company says it's worth, on their books, is higher than its recoverable amount.
So it's like when your favorite Springbok jersey from the 90s turns out to be worth only a few rand at a secondhand shop.
Exactly. That sentimental value might be high, but the market reality is different. Same applies to businesses. That shiny new factor might not be so shiny anymore if the market demand for its products has dropped. Or maybe that prime Sandton property isn't fetching the rent it used to because of load shedding.
Yeesh, load shedding strikes again.
Oh, yeah.
So how do companies figure out if an asset has taken a knock like that? Do they just guess?
There's a bit more to it than just guessing, thankfully. IAS 36 outlines certain red flags that signal a potential impairment. These can be external factors, like a change in the market, new regulations, or even something like increased competition from those Chinese imports everyone's talking about.
Yeah, internal factors too, right? Like maybe that factory equipment keeps breaking down, or the delivery backie's on its last legs.
Absolutely. Internal factors could be anything, from physical damage to obsolescence. Remember those old Nokia phones we used to love? They're pretty much worthless now, even if they still work. Technology moves fast, and companies need to keep up, or risk their assets becoming impaired.
It makes sense. So once a company sees these red flags, how do they actually figure out how impaired an asset is?
That's where the recoverable amount comes in. It's the higher of two values, what the company could get by selling the asset today, minus any selling costs, or the value they expect to get from using the asset in their business.
So they either look at what they could get for it on the open market, like Gumtree for assets, or how much money they think it'll make for them in the future.
Exactly. It's like deciding whether to sell your trusty old backy or keep using it for deliveries until it finally kicks the bucket. You'd have to weigh the pros and cons of each option.
Right. So that's the recoverable amount.
Okay.
And I think that's a good place to leave it for today. We've learned a lot about IAS 36 so far and what it means for us as savvy South African investors. But there's still more to uncover, so be sure to join us again for the next part of our deep dive into the fascinating world of asset impairment. Until then, stay curious and keep those investment instincts sharp. Sure. All All right, so we've got a handle on how companies spot those red flags and figure out the recoverable amount. But let's get down to the brass tacks. What happens when they actually discover an asset is impaired?
Does it just stay on their books like a bad memory? No, they can't just sweep it under the rug when an impairment loss is identified. It has to be recognized in the company's financial statements. Think of it like a reality check, forcing them to adjust the value of the asset to reflect its true worth.
So they have to come clean and admit their asset isn't as valuable as they thought it was?
Yeah.
Where does that show up exactly?
The impairment loss gets recorded on the balance sheet, reducing the carrying amount of the asset. And to really drive the point home, it also gets reported on the profit and loss statement, potentially impacting the company's overall profitability for that period.
Ouch, that sounds like a double whammy. So it hits both their overall asset value, A&D, their reported profits. No wonder companies try to avoid impairment like a speeding ticket.
Yeah, it's a signal to investors that the company has taken a hit, and it can impact their attractiveness for future investments. But remember, this transparency is ultimately a good thing. It's better for investors to know the true state of affairs rather than be misled by inflated asset values.
Transparency is key. Now, you mentioned that impairment losses can impact profitability. Are there any situations where this impact might be softened a bit?
There are a few scenarios where the accounting treatment can differ slightly. For example, if a company has previously revalued an asset upwards, like that fancy office building in Santon that suddenly became a hot property, any impairment loss would first be deducted from the revaluation surplus.
So they get to use that previous gain as a bit of a buffer before it hits their actual profits, like a financial cushion for those accounting bumps.
Exactly. But if the impairment loss is bigger than that revaluation surplus, the remaining amount does flow through to the profit and loss statement. It's like having a limited insurance policy on your assets.
Makes sense. So impairment losses can either be a direct hit to the profits, or they can chip away at those previous gains. Either way, it's a reminder that asset values can go down as well as up, just like the stock market or the price of petrol. Speaking of ups and downs, is there ever a chance that an impairment loss can be reversed? Can my old Springbok jersey suddenly become a collector's item again?
Well, for your Springbok jersey, it might take a Rugby World Cup victory for that to happen. But for companies under certain circumstances, an impairment loss can be reversed. This happens when the estimates used to determine the asset's recoverable amount have changed significantly since the last impairment test.
So it's not just a random upswing. There needs to be a solid reason for the change in value. What kind of reasons would justify a reversal?
Let's say the market for a particular type of asset has rebounded, or the company has found a new and innovative way to use the asset that generates higher cash flow. Maybe they've upgraded that old factory equipment to make it more efficient, or they've found a new tenant for that Santon office building who's willing to pay top rand. The key is that the improvement has to be sustained and not just a temporary blip.
So no reversing an impairment loss just because you had a good month.
Right.
Right? It has to be a real long-term improvement in the asset's outlook.
Precisely, think of it like this. You wouldn't increase the value of your taxi just because you managed to avoid a pothole for a week. You'd need to see a consistent improvement in its condition or earning potential to justify a higher valuation.
That's a solid point. But what about those intangible assets we talked about earlier, like goodwill? Can that ever be reversed if that Chisanyama loses its reputation for the best pap in Soweto? Can they ever get it back accounting-wise?
That's where things get a bit trickier. Impairment losses on goodwill cannot be reversed. This is because any future increase in goodwill is usually attributed to the company's own efforts and internal improvements rather than a change in the initial acquisition.
So they can't just say, hey, we've improved our recipe, our pap is amazing again, so our goodwill is back to what it was.
No, IAS 36 puts a firm line in the sand about any increase in goodwill after an impairment is considered internally generated and doesn't qualify for a reversal. It's like saying you've become a better driver since you bought your taxi, so its value should go up. Unfortunately, the accounting rules don't see it that way.
Okay, so goodwill impairments are a bit like a one-way street. Once it's down, it stays down. This is all very insightful. But how do we, the investors, get to see all this information? Do companies just whisper about their impairment losses in hushed tones?
No, whispering wouldn't be very transparent, would it? IAS 36 has specific disclosure requirements that companies must follow. They need to be upfront about any impairment issues, explaining the events that led to the loss, the amount of the loss, and even the assumptions they used to determine the recoverable amount.
So it's not enough to just say, hey, we had an impairment loss Sorry, they need to give us the whole story chapter and verse.
Exactly. This detailed disclosure helps investors understand the company's financial health, their decision-making process, and ultimately whether they're making sound choices with their assets. It's all about empowering investors with the information they need to make informed decisions.
Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to investing our hard-earned rands. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here, from identifying impairment to recognizing and even reversing those pesky losses. But I have a feeling there's even more to this story. What about those unique situations where things aren't so clear-cut?
You're right, there are some specific scenarios and nuances that require a bit more digging. For example, how do you measure the recoverable amount for an asset that doesn't have a readily available market value, like a specialized piece of equipment or a unique piece of artwork? And what happens when a company has to test for impairment on an asset that's not yet operational, like a new mine or a shopping mall under construction?
Ooh, those sound like some juicy accounting puzzles. I'm eager to crack those open and see what IAS 36 has to say about them. Listeners, stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore these complex scenarios and uncover even more insights into the fascinating world of asset impairment. Okay, so we're back and ready to tackle those tricky scenarios like, how do you even begin to put a price tag on something unique? Like, say, a one-of-a-kind painting or a piece of equipment built just for your factory. There's no price check for that at the supermarket.
Exactly. That's where things get really interesting. When there's no active market for an asset, determining its fair value, less costs to sell, requires a bit more detective work. Can't just look it up on Take-A-Lot or browse the classifieds.
Right, so no easy answers there. How do they even go about figuring it out? Do they just throw darts at a board with random numbers?
No. Thankfully, no IAS 36 provides some guidance. Companies can use various valuation techniques, but it often involves looking at similar assets that have been sold, considering the asset's current condition and any unique features, and factoring in things like future maintenance costs. It's a bit like trying to appraise a vintage car at a classic car show. You need expertise and a keen eye for detail.
Ah, so it's more art than science then. But does that mean there's room for companies to play fast and loose with the numbers? Could they use these techniques to inflate the value of their assets?
That's where transparency comes in. Even when using these more complex valuation techniques, companies still need to disclose the key assumptions they've made in their calculations. This allows investors to understand how they arrived at that value and make their own assessment of its reasonableness.
So it's all about showing their work, so to speak, giving investors enough information to decide for themselves whether that valuation is legit. Okay, let's move on to another head-scratcher. What about those assets that haven't even started working yet? Like a brand new shopping mall under construction in Durban. How do you assess for impairment when it's not even open for business yet?
That's a great example.
Yep.
With long-term projects or assets under construction, the focus shifts to the asset's value and use, the present value of the future cash flows the asset is expected to generate once it's up and running.
So they're basically looking into their crystal ball, trying to predict how much money that mall will rake in once the doors open. Do they have a special formula for that, or are they just winging it?
They use detailed financial projections, taking into account things like market conditions, potential rental income, projected foot traffic competition from other malls, and even those pesky municipal rates and taxes. It's a complex process that involves a lot of assumptions and estimations.
And I imagine those assumptions can make a big difference. Like how many shoppers will actually visit the mall, or how much rent those shops will be willing to pay. It seems like there's a lot of room for error, or maybe even a bit of wishful thinking.
That's why transparency is so crucial. Investors need to see those underlying assumptions clearly laid out so they can assess the reasonableness of the projections and the overall impairment assessment.
So it's like checking the weather forecast before you head to the beach. You want to know what assumptions they're using to predict sunshine? Makes sense. Now let's bring it all together and talk about those cash-generating units and goodwill. How does impairment testing work when you've got a business with different parts, each contributing to the overall bottom line?
IAS 36 requires companies to test the entire cash-generating unit for impairment, considering both the identifiable assets and the allocated goodwill. Remember that Shisanyama example. Even if the Brai station is struggling, the drinks fridge might be doing a roaring trade. They need to look at the unit as a whole.
So it's not just about individual assets. It's about how they all work together to generate cash flow for the business.
Right. Exactly. And if an impairment loss is identified for the unit, it's allocated first to reduce the carrying amount of the goodwill, and then to the other assets in the unit proportionally.
Ah, so goodwill takes the first hit. Makes sense, given its intangible nature. It's a good reminder that a company's reputation and brand value, while important, are also vulnerable. they need to be protected, just like any other asset. Well, this has been quite a journey through the world of IAS 36. We've decoded those financial statements, uncovered the secrets of impairment testing, and learned how to spot those red flags that could signal trouble ahead.
It all comes down to transparency, empowering investors with the information they need to make smart decisions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So next time you're considering an investment, remember what we've learned about IAS 36. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions. Dig into those disclosures and make sure you understand how those assets are valued. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those investment instincts sharp.